as I was putting together this panel, I realized that with the group that I was able to secure, I have the dream team of crisis communications, and I'm really pleased to have to my left Laura Kane, the head of corporate communications for Aflac, Roger Frizzell, who's the head of corporate communications for Carnival Cruise Line, and Paul Fox, who's the head of corporate communications for P&G. You know, yesterday we sat through some seminars where we were talking about marketing communications and the need for PR communicators to get more relevant work in the marketing space versus the core space. And you know, I always say that there's no better way to clear a room of marketers than to have a crisis. You can see the advertising agencies scatter, and the marketing folks just really say, not my ball, and they leave it to the pros to handle the nuances of the crisis. So I'm really pleased to have my panelists here, and the topic of today is really pivoting from the moment of crisis, or the awareness of the crisis, to the more important, I think, moment of recovery, where we get back to the business of building a corporate or a brand and reputation. And I think that each of our esteemed panelists have some really interesting insights and some relevant cases to talk about. They will be talking about some potentially confidential information, so I would respect that everybody in the room as communications professionals respect anything that is deemed confidential. I want to start with Roger. Roger, you came to the role of CEO at Carnival with more than 20 years experience, including PG&E, where I think you dealt with a blowing up of a town.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yikes. You were also in-house at American Airlines, where you dealt with some airline issues. Today, however, could you ever be prepared for what you saw at Carnival with the challenges around the Costa Concordia?
No, I mean, it's not only the Concordia that sank in Italy, as many of you may be aware, but it's also the Triumph here in the U.S. that while nobody was hurt, nobody was injured, it actually amassed more press coverage than perhaps any event I've seen where there's not any major injuries or any injuries in that fact. And the Concordia had the unfortunate situation of sitting on its side for more than a year, almost 2 years, so all the mass media could see it every day they wanted to, and they actually have cruises that just go by just to see the Concordia. So to have that and your brand be so visible, it's just a really unfortunate situation for a company in many ways, but also a tragic situation for the citizens that are living in that area, but more importantly, the people that passed away on the ship.
Can you talk a little bit about the recovery plan? Both the salvage plan, but also the communications side of that.
What we found is that both Costa Concordia and the Triumph took our brand favorability down to unrealistic numbers that we've never seen, the lowest in our company's history. And to start that recovery process, in Italy as an example, it's in an environmental safe zone. There's a number of marine life there. So not only did we have to figure out how to raise the ship, how to move the ship, but we had to also figure out how to do it in such a way that you did not have any spillage and any environmental issues. On top of that, the Italians are a very proud people, as you know, and we had to include them in the solution because if it was just an American company fixing an American problem, then you don't really solve the reputation problem. So we engaged not only an American company, of course, but we also engaged an Italian company and created a joint venture. And some of you may have seen the raising of the Concordia. There was a lot of interesting puts and takes on that because how much access do you give to the media early? How much access do you give during the event that doesn't give access to others because you have long-term relationships? We ended up doing massive pre-work with outlets such as 60 Minutes, and some of you may have seen that, Discovery. But we also did hourly press briefings, a lot of behind the scenes. We opened the door. It's the first time in my career that we had a 2 p.m., a 4 p.m., and a midnight, 2 a.m., 4 a.m., 6 a.m. press briefing. You'd think nobody would be there, but there were at least 600 media on this small island, and you couldn't go to the bathroom without cameras watching. So it was the beginning, not only of a very successful brand rebuild, but there was some pride restored to the Italian community because they were part of that great engineering solution. Nobody in the history has ever tried to refloat a boat or ship of that size and magnitude, and frankly, we didn't know if we could do it. Every hour, our breath was being held, because that first hour especially, there was so much weight, and you didn't know how much the seabed had connected with the ship. So it was a phenomenal event, but it started the process, and we're already seeing some brand recovery immediately afterwards.
Great. Laura, you have been with Aflac for quite a while, prior to that ABC, I know. Years of managing corporate issues for Aflac could not prepare you for what happened several years ago during the Japanese tsunami. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and how your team responded?
Oh, sure. So 80% of our business comes from Japan, which is something that a lot of people don't know, but it's a really big deal for us. And when the tsunami hit, we had spent the entire weekend, just trying to make sure our people were okay, figuring out what kind of losses we were going to have, and we were all pretty exhausted. And I'm in my office on Monday morning, and I get this note from the digital team. Somebody had posted on Facebook, "What is your response to Gilbert Gottfried's tweets?" I said, I have no idea. What did he tweet? And I sent off a note. And then another one came in, and I thought, okay, I really need to get to the bottom of this, because, when they start coming together like that, you've got a problem. So I went over to see the CMO, and I said, hey, do you know what Gilbert Gottfried tweeted? Because it seems to be causing something on Facebook. And he didn't, and he started making some phone calls. And while he was making those phone calls, I got a phone call from a reporter. And I said, I think I may be able to know what Gilbert Gottfried tweeted. Let me, see what the deal was. And we very quickly talked to the reporter, and I said, this is the first I'm hearing of it. I don't know what the answer is. What I would say to you is this: you could be sitting on a really interesting story, because I have a feeling that I know how we're going to handle this. I just know who we are, and we don't find those kinds of comments to be acceptable. So if you'll give me an hour, I promise I won't talk to anybody else, but let me find out. Otherwise, you got to run with no comment. So this was a reporter I worked with a lot, and he said, all right, I'll give you an hour. So we started talking to the CMO. We started drafting a press release saying that we were going to fire Gilbert. We were writing responses to the Facebook posts, and within 45 minutes, the decision actually took about 10. How do I get out of the contract was the CEO's only comment, because we decided we were going to get rid of him. And then we had the press release out. The first story had hit. And so within 45 minutes, we really got out in front of the issue, which was that you can't represent our company and say really terrible things about our largest market and the people within them. But as part of the press release, we all decided, wouldn't it be fun to open the audition up to the American people? So we said that would be great. So we put that in the press release, and that became the news story. And I left that night, after having talked to several reporters and various things, very excited, because it was a really interesting thing, but having no idea how I was going to hold all of these open auditions and make all of this work. Sad, because Gilbert Gottfried had been the only voice that the Aflac duck had known, and he's our most he's our biggest asset, right? The one thing you know about Aflac is the duck. And so a little bit nervous about how we were going to do this. And my CMO basically said, you have 6 weeks. This is our busy season. We need to make sure that we have a new voice within 6 weeks. To add to that, we had no PR firm, because we were in the middle of a PR review. We had no digital firm, because we were in the middle of a digital review as well. And fortunately, Citizen, who was in the PR review, called up and said, hey, we just saw your press release, and if you could use some help, we're willing to work with you without a contract, whatever. And that was a huge sigh of relief. I was like, yeah, okay, I'll just work with my purchasing department. We're going to have to do this, because I have a very small department, and there was no way we could pull it off on our own. And we did. And throughout the process of the audition, It was very interesting. We got a lot of heat from comedians, especially The View. They spent 3 days discussing should we have fired Gilbert Gottfried on The View. I just found that amazing. And there was a lot of backlash, and Gilbert apologized, and I'm sure he was, very sorry and all of that, but we'd already made our decision. We were moving on. And so also the Screen Actors Guild, who happened to be a client, they offer Aflac, was very upset that we weren't going with professional talent and we weren't taking their constituents seriously, and they threatened to charge us for every audition that showed up anywhere, and so we just had a lot of different things to maneuver through, but ultimately, it was a huge success story, and we never looked back. We knew we made the right decision. The phone calls we got at the call center in Japan confirmed that the Japanese people agreed with us, and so we just kept going.
Great. I'm sure we'll have some questions about that case as well as Rogers. Paul Fox, dear friend and client and veteran PR professional in corporate communications, with 15 years at Gillette, and then after the acquisition of Gillette by P&G, now P&G, you must have seen myriad crises come and go, particularly in your role as the manager of them. Tell us about one or two that are most poignant, and your ability to kind of respond in a kind of a sensitive but also appropriate way.
When you look back, throughout my career, not just at P&G, there've been some monumental, events that I can look back on, whether there are aircraft accidents that I've, handled in the past, which have been true tragedies. The case studies that you've looked at with Roger and these events that happen, whether it's a ship running aground off the coast of Italy, you immediately know you're in a crisis. Whether it's a natural disaster, like for instance in the Philippines that we've just seen, you know that you're in a bad place. But for the vast majority of issues and crises that bubble up, they're not those types of events. And the small incremental changes that happen to your brands or your company that over time places you in a position of crisis. And one of the things that we always do, regardless of what case study, if you like, we're looking at, what event we're looking at, is really to understand where are you, right? So this landscape assessment, just how bad is it? And how bad could it become? Because that perspective when you're dealing with a crisis is absolutely pivotal. And I know you want to talk about, at what point do you move from handling the issue
Sure.
to rebuilding a brand or a company. Understanding those dynamics of where you are, what are the cues and the characteristics of the environment as you sit right now, and how bad can it become, is the trigger for knowing when you're going to rebuild. And that rebuilding can happen within hours, it can happen within weeks or months. If you take a well-documented case like the issue with the Gulf of Mexico with BP. At what point do you say that particular brand begins to rebuild? Now, you could say it was the moment in time when they managed to cap the well. You could say that was the moment in time when their problems began to stop. But if you look at that as a case study, I would certainly argue that they began rebuilding that brand weeks before that event, when they began to engage with their consumers, as it were. Because one of the criticisms that leveled at BP was that they weren't responsive enough, right? And we could spend the rest of the time we got this morning, debating that one, case study. But once they started to engage and demonstrate to the public exactly what they were doing, you could say that brand rebuilding began. And of course, it was literally capped off when they stopped the oil flow into the Gulf of Mexico. But when we've got $25 billion brands. We've got something like 250 brands around the world. But, we've got about 25 that account for about 80% of our $84 billion, revenues. And, every single day, we're touching, or let's put it like this, about 4.6 billion consumers use a P&G brand every single day. So when you're dealing with that universe, you've got to be ready. You've got to be ready because you can't please all of the people all of the time. And you know, you've got to be ready, and you've got to understand what the landscape you're working in and understand the trends and the characteristics, because it's those cues at that point that will allow you to tell you when it's time to start rebuilding a brand. And we can talk about that a little bit more.
What are some of the resources you use to pull into that landscape assessment, and what are the most valuable to you? And then the third part of that is there any substitute for good judgment?
I don't think. I think judgment is the pivotal characteristic of good crisis and issue management. If you look at all the bad things, when you hold up these worst scenarios and you pull out, whether it's Tony Hayward's comments in the BP crisis, for instance, you usually get down to the fact that it was just poor judgment. Right? Poor judgment of doing something that you shouldn't have done, or not doing something you should have done. Right? And one of the things that we try and stress with our people is that take yourself and get some perspective, understand what you're doing, because one of the things I think when you're in a crisis situation, you hear people talking about it all the time about the urgency of response. You've got to work in real time, but I think this demand for urgency really belays the real critical elements of handling a crisis. It's like the advice you give people. If you see a fire, throw something on it. Right? And on face value, that's really good advice, and a lot of people would follow that. But if what you pour onto the fire is gasoline, you're going to get a very different effect. And taking your time to look at an issue. Okay, I know you and I have spoken in the past about just how long have you got, and I think you shared with me that today you've got about 4 minutes before you need to say something. I'd rather not say anything within 4 minutes. If it's gonna shape the next few weeks for me, I'd rather take double that time to make sure that we get it right. And I think when we look back, if you look at sort of behavioral science 101, right? Because I think that begins to help shape how we communicate in a digital age that we live in right now. Because the fact is, we're all wired to act the same way. Right? And we sit here and we develop very complicated plans, right? And we think through every scenario. And we like to think that people will use the same level of scrutiny to look at our actions. The truth of the matter is that 95% of all our decisions are taken because it feels right. 5% we actually give some real proper thought to because we're wired to do that. It goes back to the days when you were on the plains of Africa, and the only thing that was key was to be able to tell the lion from the grass. And even though we live in this wonderfully civilized world now, our brains are still wired to act that way. So we make decisions very quickly as human beings based on fragments of information because they feel right. And if it feels right, then that's what you decide to do.
Right.
And I think understanding what those cues are, Darryl, is the absolute key to understanding how to move from defense to offense.
I think the speed issue, and I'll footnote it just for the group, at a recent Page Society conference, we heard Dr. Vincent Cavello talk about the speed and sense of urgency for responding in a crisis, and his research showed that 20 years ago, a company or a brand or an organization had 48 hours plus or minus to actually respond before the news cycle kind of completely filtered through. 10 years ago, with the advent of the digital age, that was reduced down to 4 hours. And the recent research after the Boston Marathon bombing is that the news cycle will be filled, that vacuum will be filled within 4 minutes of the crisis. Someone will speak up with an educated opinion about the issue. And if you don't, someone else is filling that void. And you may be okay with waiting and seeing to see how that plays out. But in some cases, if it's other people alerting you to your problem and you don't have a response, it can put you on your heels for a minute. Roger, can you talk about the sense of urgency in your career? Where was the need for an immediate response really most pressing?
What I found at American Airlines, perhaps more so than a Compaq or an HP or even an AT&T, the level of crisis changes, so that perhaps the need for immediacy also changes with it. As a result, one of the things that I think that we did at American Airlines, perhaps as well as any company I'd ever been a part of, is we built our crisis plan with a template that took out the guessing. We really had all the top executives prepare to sign off on it, prepare the quote. You can spend 10 minutes to 10 hours on approving a quote in a big corporation. So we went through the process of having 3 releases, all pre-prepared, that go in the first 5 minutes, the first 15 minutes, the first 30 minutes, the first hour. We really mapped out the first day to try to take out the thinking. Now, within that, you have some latitude to make sure that you do as you suggested, that you make some adjustments. But for the most part, the first release doesn't say a whole lot. It just communicates that you're aware and you're on it, and it lets the media and the public know that you're not asleep at the wheel. And from there, you enhance it, and usually in every crisis plan we had that had any significance, such as a crash or a major issue with a mechanical, there was a press briefing as part of it on the first day, usually within 4 hours. And then there was travel to the site, and there was a number of things. So I thought the same thing was true in the nuclear industry, where the emergency is so large that you need that templated crisis plan. But what I find in the recovery of a crisis, a lot of companies do really, really well during the crisis. And what I found with American when I joined them, with PG&E when I joined them, it's after the crisis, their plan is kind of over. And what happens more times than not, a lot of presidents and CEOs and others allow their communications function to just shut down. And some of them even force it. They don't even budget it, perhaps, and they go quiet. And that's the worst thing you can do. And sometimes it's led because advertising says we got to be quiet. We got to shut down advertising. Again, my counsel is that's the worst thing you can do. And in every case, I saw that not only American Airlines, but PG&E and even Carnival had such a huge issue because it went quiet. And if they would have continued to communicate, they might still have problems, but not the level. And so I think as communicators, one of the things we have to fight against is the judgment to go dark. And it's a real issue. And again, I've seen budgets cut severely through that process. And you don't even recover those budgets for a year or two because of that. So it's a systemic problem that we have to watch for.
I think it goes back to that good judgment and doing what's right. I imagine it starts at the top with the CEO and the CMO, particularly when there's spending involved. Laura, can you talk a little bit about how quickly you reacted with a recovery program, but how supportive your C-suite was?
Yeah, one other thing to piggyback on that is that when the tsunami hit, our CEO was everywhere. We had him booked on every business program and talking. And we talked several times to the Wall Street Journal, to New York Times, any number of people. And we acknowledged that, we don't have all the answers, and we made it very clear, look, as we understand the situation now, here's how it was. And I can't tell you how many reporters were really thankful because they said, we called MetLife, we called Aetna, we've called everybody, and nobody will talk to us. And in fact, lawyers from MetLife and Aetna were calling our lawyers saying, are you guys crazy? Why are you out there talking? And so it was a really interesting thing, but that was a decision that the C-suite said, no, we get it. Look, 80% of our business is in this country. Our stock is going to tank if we're not out there talking, and we might be wrong, but we're going to explain why we think what we think, and if we're wrong, we have all those reporters, ready to make the correction. So we were very lucky because, the decision was we'll communicate with anybody, and my CEO said, I don't care if it's podunk Times, I will talk to them. And literally, like every 15, 20 minutes for days, we were putting him on the phone. We had the actuaries in one room. We all gathered in one large conference room just to see how things evolved. We had a telepresence system, and we're constantly on the phone with Tokyo, and there'd be aftershocks, and we'd watch them shake, and we'd go, oh my God, what's going on? And so it was a really good thing because we all agreed, look, whatever it is, we'll just be honest about how we're dealing with it. And because that was the position we took, it made my life so much easier.
Paul, you report to AG in some respects as well as Mark. How do you find the process of securing alignment with those important gentlemen?
I think fundamentally, individuals like Mark and AG, they understand, the value of reputation. That's what the brands are built on. That's what the company is built on. So really, it's a sale that doesn't have to be sold. They immediately understand that these are things that need to be dealt with, and they put the resources against it that we need. So we never have that argument. But I want to pick up on a comment that Roger made, because it's something that I so firmly believe in terms of rebuilding a brand or rebuilding a company after a crisis. Because Roger's right. The instinct is to go quiet. And if you actually sit back from it and really think about what built this brand, or what built our reputation over the years, you wouldn't go quiet. Because those are the very things that have built the reputation of your brand in the minds of the consumers that you're trying to serve. And in a digital age that we live in right now, I know a lot of communications people are wrestling down, the role of social media, for instance, in this. Is it the accelerant of crises that we deal with today? And when you're dealing with, a social media issue, and you've built up a community that are often, highly influential, and are often the source of some of the issues that you're actually trying to deal with in the first place. How many times that after you've been dialoguing with that community and the crisis is over, do you walk away from it? It's the most astonishing thing. That you've built this community. Well, maybe you didn't build it, it just happened to arrive on your doorstep. But then when it's all over, you stop talking to them again. And potentially, that's a group, maybe they won't all be advocates for you, but they certainly want to talk to you. So why would you close the door on them once you're into this recovery mode?
Right.
It's absolute insanity to do that. Maybe every instinct is, I don't want to talk to him anymore because I've spent, weeks and weeks and weeks of my life that I'll never get back arguing my case. But at the end of the day, you've got that community to a point, and then you walk away from it. And I've never really understood the principles of that because at the end of the day, what you're trying to rebuild is the popularity of your brand. And you don't do that by going into a vacuum and being quiet.
Right.
I can remember, years. One of my passions is fly fishing, and about 15, 20 years ago, a fly was created which seemed to be catching all the fish. It was astonishing within the fly fishing community that this one little fly was the one thing that seemed to catch these fish. And I remember asking a question about, what were the characteristics of this fly that made it so compelling to trout? And somebody who was much wiser than me said, because everybody's using it. And it's true. If everybody was using this fly, then it's bound to catch more fish. There wasn't any special characteristic of this thing. It was just that, word of mouth had shot out and people were talking about this thing. So everybody tied it on the end of the line, and lo and behold, it caught a lot of fish. But, after a couple of years, people were tying on something else, which was equally popular, because it moved on. And I think it's, it's a little story, if you like, about the power of popularity. Because if things are perceived to be popular, then people want them.
Well, I also think that you mentioned social media, and perception can quickly become reality in social media channels today. And I think one of the fascinating things that I think we deal with as communicators is looking at the notion of letting influencers and even community leaders self-police the kind of the truth within the conversation versus when we step in as a brand. Does that inspire any recent anecdotes from your businesses where you've had to kind of step in and kind of course correct a online conversation in a real serious way because it had gotten out of control?
Well, I'll give you an example that sounds very trite. We had one of our airlines that was attached to a baggage system that happened to have a cat. And the cat got lost in the New York airport. And that cat became an immediate sensation online because all cat lovers around the world were concerned that our airline had lost this cat. And the unit, the New York team, was not going to spend much time or effort or money. And we immediately had to step in and say, we're going to hire a pet detective. We went beyond and above the call of duty because this thing had emerged. And we were able to have some tools that could watch how big it was growing, and that gave us the data to step in with some strength. But left to the business team, they would have done not much different than they ever did. So it's a great example of you have to have some measurement, you have to kind of have some instinct, but you have to step in. And we were able to quiet it so it became a sensation, but not an ongoing sensation that lasted beyond a week.
That's terrific. Well, how about you?
Well, I think we could. There are many examples where we've stepped in and engaged in the social media arena. Some of them have become, infamous or famous at least. I remember the dialogue between Allspice and Taco Bell, which I know it was the most remarkable and creative example of two brands talking to each other and engaging and creating literally a massive dialogue online. But in a crisis situation, I go back and say, there are times when the community actually doesn't want to hear from you. And they want to boil over an issue. And in fact, engaging at that time is a little bit like putting accelerant on a fire. You have to pick your time to actually move in and engage. There are other times when you'll find other parts of a community, not necessarily crisis central, but there will be other parts of the community that are invested in your brand that do want to talk. And I remember we were dealing with one particular issue a few years ago, and it was primarily a social media issue. It was very real, and it affected the brand, but this specific community had no interest in talking to the brand. It had formed an opinion, and it was feeding itself, and there wasn't much we could do about it. In fact, when we tried to engage it very early on, the brand probably did accelerate the discussion. But instead, we turned our attention to other parts of that particular brand's universe and took a very interesting decision to bring them in, to bring in the most influential bloggers, as it were. They were highly invested in that community, and bring them in and say, the floor's yours. You can go where you want. You can talk to who you want. You can be as investigative as you want to be, because we've got nothing to hide.
And they responded to that?
And yeah, they did. They came in droves. In fact, the entire blogging community that covered that particular area came in and spent two to 3 days. And they did talk to whoever they wanted to. And we had no control, of course, over what was written, but you had to have the faith to understand that there wasn't anything to hide. They would uncover the truth, and the truth of that was that this social media situation just simply wasn't true. And it was a very successful strategy. Right? So it's really picking which of the parts of the community you need to engage in.
Sure.
There's
a great example.
A story of perception versus reality. At PG&E, we have smart meters that we're rolling out as digital meters, radio digital meters in the side of your houses. Many states are starting to have those. In California, it was becoming a huge sensation because you had a group that thought it was Big Brother watching over them. You had a group that thought their marijuana growing might be in jeopardy. And you had a group that thought it was cancer causing. So it was becoming a daily issue in the media where there were massive undertakings of people taking their smart meters off and turning them in, people doing all kinds of amazing things that you would never expect, and it was growing each day. And the solution for the business was to ignore it because we knew it was wrong. We had the science and the math, and this was a case where it doesn't matter what the science and math is. We need to give people a choice. So we counseled the business and worked with the business to say, forget the facts. Right now, it's about perception, which is becoming reality. And our perception is, from our customers, that this is dangerous. Let's give them a choice, maybe even charge them a fee for that choice. And as a result, we gave them a choice on smart meters, start charging them a fee, they can opt out, and immediately, the press coverage started to die. The issue practically went away. So there's an example of what you've been talking about.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to this perception. 95% of our decisions are on autopilot because it feels right. And Roger just pointed out a classic example. If something feels right to make that decision, reality really doesn't matter, right? Because we're wired to get to the best decision we can in as fast a time as we can, because that's enabled the human species to dominate the planet, because we're very, very good at doing that. So sometimes the facts really don't matter. It's what people believe.
Another purview that we now have access to is more and more PR firms are leading content creation for the social media channels. Do we have any examples of compelling content that you were able to create with your communications team to help turn around a story early on in the crisis recovery process? Anyone?
Well, I think there's lots of examples. I think some of our brands do phenomenal jobs of dealing with things. But probably in recent years, the best use I've seen of infographics was BP. When it was a traditional, if you like, PR problem, and the digital team on that crisis moved in after the fact, which I think was interesting. But they came in several weeks after the whole issue was really, it got out of control, if you remember back. That BP had lost pretty much all the communications channels at that point. The press conferences were being run by somebody else. The government had stepped in, which is a nightmare situation for anybody in PR if you're dealing with a crisis and you don't control the communications. But when they moved in that digital team, their use of infographics to demonstrate what was happening in the Gulf, it was simple, it was highly consumable, and most importantly, it was shareable. Because you can create as much content as you like, but unless it's shareable, I'd have a big question mark against it, apart from driving some revenue stream and generating this stuff in the first place. But is it shareable? Is it compelling? Is it authentic?
And probably for us, like BP, when I was at PG&E, it's very similar. It's kind of a scientific business, and a large part of the consumers don't care or don't want to care. So we happened to have a situation where we did blow up a town with our gas system, and what we did afterwards was kind of esoteric. It was, who cared? And you could even explain how many miles of pipe you're laying and what you're doing, and the public just didn't get it. So through graphics and through some very simple explanations and using some third parties to help explain it, we were able to start putting it down in a language where people cared about, and they said, oh, so this is what you're doing. And then what we saw is the San Bruno residents start getting behind it a bit. And so instead of fighting us, they start feeling better because action was happening. And if it was just simple words, we never would have had enough. It really took the graphic element, a lot of it, and a lot of photos where we had a smart pig going through, I love that, smart pig, going through the pipe, and you could see that pig looking at the pipe and cleaning it all out and making sure that it's cleared of any issues. That kind of photo and those kind of graphics made a difference.
Yeah, we're kind of struggling with what we do digitally, largely because we're a highly regulated industry, because there are a lot of privacy issues around healthcare. So we're playing with it. We're doing more just in terms of trying to help people navigate through the new national health care, which has gotten a pretty positive response, and we feel good about that shareable kind of information. But it's still a bit of a challenge for us, trying to figure out where we should go, where we can't, what the rules are, and we're working real close with compliance and the lawyers and everyone, and I think we'll get there, but we're still working through it.
It's terrific. We have a few minutes left. I wanted to take some questions from the audience, so I think there's some microphones floating around. Yes, sir. Here it comes. It's running.
Thanks. Good morning, Stephen Forshaw. I'm interested, as someone who's been through an air crash on the inside myself, and a number of you have too, and it's not a pleasant experience for anyone. There's a lot of debate in the aviation industry that came to a head quite recently when Thai Airways had an aborted landing that went wrong in Bangkok, and they sent the paint trucks out to immediately paint over the logo. And there was a lot of debate about this at the time, and rightfully so, I think. The perception is if you paint over the logo, it somehow does something to improve or preserve the brand image of the logo, which I think must be one of the most bizarre pieces of logic I've ever heard. But I'm wondering what the panel's view on this is now that I've biased you with my own view on it. Do you share that view? Is it something that really... This sounds like something written by some marketing person in an airline that really doesn't have much of a clue that the brand image is already damaged and you've just got to focus on rebuilding and recovering.
Yeah, my view is you're creating another PR issue through that process. However, with that said, we did have a crash landing in Kingston, Jamaica several years ago, and what we did do within a reasonable amount of time is got the crash to the hangar. So that would have been a normal process. I hate having my brand hang out there. If I can help it, I want to move it if it's all possible, assuming the NTSB will allow you to do so. But as far as painting over a logo, I think it's a real ill-conceived process.
That's an interesting thought process that would lead you to do that.
The opposite of transparency.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Opaqueness.
But you raise it. You shot me back about 30 years. Because I handled one of those. It wasn't, Thai was the most recent example of that, but I can remember back in the 1980s handling an aircraft accident, a small one. It was a training exercise, so only the crew was on board, and they were doing something is referred to as circuit and bumps around an airfield, where they come in, literally the tires just bump down and they take off again. And they'd done this for about an hour or so, and just got it wrong on one of the approaches, and the plane crashed. And the crew, the maintenance crew at the time, threw a tarpaulin over the tailplane. So it's effectively the same thing. And afterwards, I asked, what sort of logic would get you to that? That when I get the call and somebody says, "Was that your airplane?" What am I going to say, right? No, oh no, I don't recognize that one. Maybe it belongs to somebody else. It was absolutely ridiculous. I couldn't even fathom the logic that would get you to take that sort of decision. It's astonishing, particularly in the transparent world that we live in. I mean, it's insanity. And I agree with Roger that you create a new story, a new story, as a result of doing it. Why would you want to do that?